Well, we're hoping to speak to one of the opposition leaders, but I'm afraid the internet connection with Belarus is just too unstable. So just how damaging has the A-level debacle been for the government? A Snap YouGov poll today suggests that 75% of people think the government handled the A-level results badly. And here's the verdict of tomorrow morning's front pages. The Daily Mail, another fine mess. The Daily Telegraph, Williamson shifts blame to exam watchdog after grades climb down. The Guardian, government forced into humiliating exams U-turn. The Daily Mirror, this is no way to run a country. The Daily Express, victory for common sense in exams fiasco. And The Times, scramble for university after exam U-turn. Well, I am joined by Katy Balls, Deputy Political Editor of the Spectator, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer for The Observer. Good evening to both of you. First of all, Katy Balls, now we know this was building for 5 months. Surely there's no excuse for this.
Well, that's the view amongst many Tory MPs. They're looking at the fact this was a set deadline. Everyone knew when exam results were supposed to come up. So why wasn't there a plan in place, particularly because we saw what happened in Scotland just a few weeks before? And I think that's why there's been so much anger within the party. In terms of why the government has moved now, I think that ultimately there is a sense this is an imperfect situation as soon as exams weren't sat. They thought the algorithm was broadly the best way of doing this. But as soon as those outliers, those people on the side of the statistical model that don't benefit became, real life stories and you heard about their own heartache, I think it made it very hard to sustain the position.
But when you heard Sam Freeman earlier in the programme and others, Katie Normanton, talk about the ongoing problems, it may be that we're only actually starting to see what might unfold now, and actually we've perhaps created even more problems going forward.
Yeah, I think every single option, to be honest, at this point has problems. I think the view in government is that this is the least worst option, but a lot still rests. And as we heard earlier in the programme, I think we have to see the response from universities and also the effect on the next year. I think already you had Tory MPs have a Q&A this evening with one of the education ministers. And one issue that did come up in that, I understand, was what about the next year? Because yes, we just had predicted grades, but we also have a problem in the sense that there are pupils now supposed to sit exams next year who have missed 5 months of school. And I think this is an ongoing problem, particularly if we now have university places going, so there are less next year. So, Sonia, we already know that this was coming a long time, that Labour's response was actually rather lacklustre and rather late. Do you think that they were actually also caught in the hop?
I think they were a bit lacklustre at first, and I think what's quite extraordinary, actually, I think they've been much stronger now, but it does feel like they were a bit behind the curve. And I think what's extraordinary is it feels like sort of politicians from all sides of the political spectrum to some extent were caught out by this. You saw the same with the SNP in Scotland. And everyone knew this was coming down the track. Obviously the blame lies with the government first and foremost. And it's just beggars belief that they first didn't see this coming, but second, looking forwards, what they've done is just pushed this crisis onto universities. They've been completely incompetent. They've not come up with a plan for universities.
What's the policy alternative from Labour? It didn't seem that Labour actually had a plan.
Well, I think Labour would say, well, it's up to the government to come up with a plan. Obviously, they're in government. But I think Labour could have been pushing more on some of the specifics. So, for example, on university admissions, why hasn't the government said that it will fund those middle and lower tier universities who might have fewer students because the more highly selective universities are now going to be oversubscribed? So we could have seen more specifics from Labour, you're right. But at the end of the day, this is the stuff that, government's in government. They're the ones who've got to come up with this stuff.
You heard Sam Freeman say there that Gavin Williamson's position, it was if, it was actually negligent and so he's still there.
Well, I think if you look at this government, it's kind of, Sam was absolutely right. 20 years ago, this would have been a resigning matter for any minister in the cabinet. The bar has really shifted. We saw that in the way that Boris Johnson hung on to Dominic Cummings back in May. He's not a minister, obviously, he's an advisor, but he blatantly breached the spirit of lockdown guidelines. Boris Johnson has sort of been very clear that he wants to hang on to ministers, advisors who are loyal to him, even if they're costing him him quite a high price politically, which is what's happening here.
So Katy Balls, you could say at the beginning of COVID, everybody was feeling their way because we didn't know how COVID was going to move. We don't know how damaging it was going to be also for the economy at that stage. So you could say that this is not an isolated incident because, of course, you had track and trace, you had school meals that were then hurriedly got together for the summer, you had the NHS migrant surcharge. People will forgive all these problems at the start, but actually, when you see disadvantaged children being further disadvantaged by this, people will not be so forgiving.
Yeah, I think we've had clearly a very challenging situation in terms of pandemic. The government has made several mistakes, and I think there has been actually at times a surprising amount of public patience in terms of this. I think there is a sense on schools, also just if you look at the response inside the Tory party, there was a lot of fury tonight, both at the Education Secretary, but also at number 10, the idea being like, that if you look at how this Downing Street operation operates, they're quite controlling. I think the sense that Gavin Williamson has gone completely rogue here is probably quite off in the general handling. But I think on schools, it's such a key issue to the Tories. And I think that's why this particularly hurts them. And I think that if you look at it, a lot of Tory MPs believe that the whole purpose of what they are doing is to try and provide fairness and opportunity. And I think that's why this algorithm and the decision to stick by it for as long as the government did really does create a stink.
But, you know, we saw pupils were marching at the weekend. Students were actually going to sue the government. I mean, this was going to be incredibly damaging for the government. Is this a kind of Nick Clegg tuition fee moment?
I think the question now is what has this done to quell in terms of the level of anger, potential rebellions? I think that by making this move now, what the Tories hope they have done is they have prevented this becoming an issue as big as tuition fees. We have to see what happens with university places, but ultimately you're not as likely to have a generation of students who feel their life chances have been significantly reduced because of the Tory government. We still have questions to answer in university, but I think that has been reduced, and it's in large part of why they moved when they did.
But it has a long tail, because if there's an impact on next year, we're still going to be remembering what happened 12 months ago.
That's absolutely right. And all the government has done is sort of push this into next week with university admissions, because there's huge confusion now over university admissions. If you're a young person who has actually got higher grades than they originally thought from the algorithm, but you've accepted your insurance place from university, are you going to be able to get your original offer back? These are hugely high stakes decisions for young people.
DfE seems to suggest you will. That actually, they said something, you can set aside the other offer and go for your first offer. But that's not sure that we're actually going to...
It's not sure, and it's very difficult for the university sector, because what happens is that every university offers more places than they've got available. So you're going to have more young people wanting to go to the more highly selective institutions. You've got all the COVID restrictions in place from this autumn, and you've got universities that are sort of more middle and in the lower ranking tiers who are going to possibly be short of students and face going bankrupt. So it's a huge problem for the university sector. So it's not an issue that's gone away for the government.
Just before we go, Katy, it's been announced tonight that Dido Harding has been appointed the head of the Health Protection Institute for England, which replaces Public Health England. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there are lots of people who don't think test and trace is quite there yet. Perhaps that's to put it kindly, and she's in charge of it. But I think ultimately, with Public Health England being disposed of, the Tories are going to have to take more responsibility going forward if there are more mistakes on issues relating to coronavirus.
Thank you all very much indeed. And that's it from us tonight. I'm back tomorrow. Stay safe. Good night.